This episode is sponsored by Hero Schedule. If your department needs better scheduling software that isn't outdated, clunky, and expensive, Hero Schedule is an easy switch. It's $4 per user per month, and they give you a free 30-day trial. Get started at heroschedule.com and click on Try Hero Schedule.
And that's very, I'm typically like, I think the best out of everybody. But that one point in time, I did that. And then for years afterwards, they always talked about that moment. Like, we saw a side of you, the complete leader, right? Like, that you weren't just going to get bowled over by a strong personality and that you stood up for us.
I never had a problem with him again. And I like to share that story in versions of incidents like that, especially with younger supervisors. Hey, if it does happen, don't be surprised and just be ready for it. Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by Chris Hsiung. Sir, retired chief, retired undersheriff. We'll just start with that. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Absolutely. So I'm excited to share your story, your career progression, and then the work you're doing today, these days with the Curve and what that's all about. But for starters, I just wanted to thank you for coming on the show. As we were talking prior to the recording and then just before hopping on, I think it's always helpful to share story. It's something that I get distracted and I usually pull away from that. But ultimately, when we recall back to when we were at a certain point of our career, it's always helpful to see not just the what people do in the course of their career, but also the why and the how. And that's truly what I glean so much learning from. And so just to be able to share your story with more people and highlight that is something that I'm really excited about.
Well, thanks for having me. I mean, I've been a fan. I've been watching you from a distance on social media, so it's an honor to kind of get to connect with you online and even spend some time chatting today.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So one thing that I've shared about this before, but in my, I suppose, coming up and coming of age, I had a strange kind of awareness and relationship with my heritage. And to some extent, I remember being a kid and really trying to Americanize and really distance myself from, my Chinese American upbringing. My parents immigrated, so, there's the rice cooker always on. And we connected a little bit about that. But I kind of set the stage there because in law enforcement, I recall coming in and wondering if people would perceive me as a diversity hire. And the only reason why I bring that up is because there still aren't a ton of Asian American law enforcement officers in the US. And I wanted to kind of start there because you came ahead of me. And so there are presumably, even fewer at the time. And so I kind of wanted to ask you about that and what that was like with your own recognition, where that came from and how your family received that and processed that.
Yeah, great question. And it was something I wrestled with early on. My story is basically as an 8-year-old, or I'm a first generation. So my parents immigrated as well.
Mm-hmm.
And as an 8-year-old, I remember our house got burglarized, and we grew up in the East Bay, which is out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I remember very distinctly the stress that brought about the family, but also the feeling of when that police car pulled up and the officer came out, and I was like, I couldn't stop staring at his uniform and the duty belt and everything. I'm like, I want to do that. But that was also contrasted with, as you kind of touched on, our cultural heritage, which is like, I was kind of probably, I don't know if the term is brainwashed or encouraged, but basically like, hey kid, your choices are doctor, lawyer, or engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And, I kind of gave it the old try. I mean, in high school, I remember those programs where you get to spend a day with a profession, right? And I did the whole thing with a doctor and a lawyer and an engineer. And I was just like, I'm just not feeling it. I knew back then I just didn't want to be in an office all day. Ironic because later on in my career, that's all I did was sit in an office.
Isn't that the irony? Yeah.
It is. But I did a ride along at 16 years old. I did a ride along with the agency that in the community that I was growing up in, Foster City PD. And man, I was hooked from the second And I, looking back, I think the officer was kind of hamming it up a little bit. We were going to a robbery call, and
Mm,
he's like, flooring the car, and the engine's going, and I got that adrenaline rush, and I'm like, I'm hooked. That's it. I very quickly became an explorer at that point with that agency. Spent a few years there, then got a part-time job there as a community service officer. All the while, I think my parents were still kind of like, hey, maybe you'll snap out of it, or maybe
it's a phase. Yeah.
maybe you'll see the other side.
Yeah.
But I didn't, and I went on obviously start testing. And my mom was pretty concerned. She carried a lot of the very traditional kind of, even remember at my academy graduation, she was like, "Okay, now don't go out and arrest bad people. Okay, just stay safe." And I'm
Hmm.
like, "Yeah, no, that's just not how it works." But what was funny was even in college, my college roommate, who also happens to be of Chinese heritage, he was the same thing. Like his parents were like, "You got to finish college," and he went in as a chemical engineering major. And kind of true to our heritage, I guess, you kind of do that thing where you honor your parents. So he went
Hmm.
and got his degree in chemical engineering, but he had a love for policing, and he went off and became a very successful, San Jose PD guy, narcotics, everything. So, I think it helped at that time to have a close friend who was also could share kind of that journey. When I landed at Mountain View PD, I was one of very, very few minorities, and I think one of three Asians in a department of 96 sworn. And it was at the beginning. I'm going to date myself here. It was back in 96, right? And that was the beginning, historically, for your listeners, the beginning of the COPS grants. And when agencies started getting a ton of money to hire a lot of people. And so I was at the front end of a huge hiring wave. And what that meant for my career was there was a lot of opportunity, and I would put in for stuff, and I didn't get every single thing. But when I did get a specialty or I did get a promotion, I would always hear in the background certain voices were like, "Oh, well, he got it because he's Asian."
Mm.
Or at the time I had a bachelor's and I went on to get a master's, I would hear like, "Oh, well, he got it because he's got a master's," right? And I think internally that just drove me to want to prove everyone wrong, and to basically do twice, three times, four times better than everybody on whatever I was trying to do.
Well, thank you for sharing that span. There are a couple pieces I'd like to go back to and just kind of highlight. First off, I love when you said that the officer was kind of jazzing it up a little bit.
Mhm.
That's great community engagement, right? Like just to give someone, like, meet them halfway. You have this excited kid, and just to just pump the gas a little bit. But shout out to those programs that bring people in, like explorers, right? Because
Mhm.
it's all about bridging, and there's so many flavors of community engagement. There's like the typical programs and events, but then there's also just interacting with folks. I
Mhm.
love how BC Sanders talks about that, where he just like, yeah, community engagement's getting out of your car and talking to people and
Yeah.
seeing what's up, seeing how you can help them. They'll tell you what the problems are, and then you can lead that into action. I wanted to talk about that. I also love your recounting of your mom kind of saying like, don't go arrest the bad guys, because she's concerned about you, right? Is that danger element. I similarly remember my mom when I was in academy or coming out, where she said, Eric, don't be a hero. And I was like, that's literally what I'm supposed to do, right? Like heroic acts, and like
Right.
not an ego thing, like I'm a hero, I'm better than, but no, we have to be called to do things and we have to step up. And we are all, by virtue of the job, answering the call. And so I remember being a little unsure how to receive that at the time. Looking back, it was like totally from a place of love. But I think that there is that cultural piece was definitely a hurdle for me to try to process. Okay, like, is this support? Is it lack of support? And ultimately, it's become very, very different. I think, as most people could probably recognize, that when you, not necessarily promotion even, but when you're selected for things, it's competitive, and so you have to put effort into it, and you have to earn it. And I think that's a degree of achievement that is very prevalent in Asian American culture, that that was good to be able to provide, my mom, my family to see.
Yeah, and as I had kind of grown up in the ranks, what I also noticed as more and more I got to know more and more Asian officers was this realization that in many of the countries that their families came from, police in those countries were just straight up corrupt, right? So
Mm-hmm.
not, I kind of understand now the parent generation, which is like, I don't want my son or daughter going into something that has this negative connotation, because that's all they know, right? And then they come
Yep.
here, and it's a reminder to us that immigrants that come to this country see anyone in uniform in a very different lens. And now their kid wants to go do something like that. It's like, hold on a second. So it was a growth opportunity for me, and it opened up some conversations with my parents. I mean, the epilogue is, as I began to rise through the ranks, surely, slowly but surely, both parents started to kind of turn and understand that, okay, it wasn't everything we thought it was. I mean, granted, I didn't really tell them about all the dangerous, crazy stuff,
Mm.
that we did, but they saw it more as a career as opposed to just this phase.
Yeah, and I can definitely see that aspect. And personally, I do remember having conversations with my family where, and that was probably more of the phase of trying to talk me out of it. My mom's like, "You, I mean, like, thank you, mom. You're probably not listening a whole lot, hopefully, because I try to tell you not to, but this one would be cool." And anyhow, my mom essentially a single parent, and by virtue of how I was raised, and saving up enough money for me and my sister to go to school. And that's how our culture will show love, is like provide opportunity, right? It's always about better than what we had. And then with her cultural background, to see someone, her son choosing a vocation, right? Not like a career, right? Because that is what she knew. That is what the culture knows. It's unskilled labor, essentially. It's a job that a lot of people that don't have an education and don't have opportunities, they can go do that. She's like, well, I guess, like, looking back in Taiwan, it's like, if you don't have an education, you don't have opportunities, you don't even have skills, you can go to unskilled labor, or you can go into like the police. And I'm like, well, that's a very different way to look at it, right? Whereas, especially on the West Coast, it is something that's competitive, and formal education or not, you have to have skills. You have to have a sharpness about you. You have to have intuition, social skills, all these things to be a successful cop, as we know. When you got into law enforcement, you're doing the thing, you're doing the dangerous things that you're not telling your family about. I can definitely relate to that. What did you do as far as assignments? What did you gravitate towards, and how did that evolve as your career continued?
So obviously started off in patrol, loved every minute of it. I was one of those guys that just loved being on graveyards or swing shift. The camaraderie, the action, you know, and this, in most communities after 1 or 2 in the morning, it's just you and the bad guys, right? And then
Hmm.
occasionally, community members run around that you're there to protect. But I did a couple years there, and then some opportunities came up to be an FTO. I really learned and loved that, right? Teaching people and learning that process. And then detective openings started to open up, property crimes, which is where I started off just to get my feet wet. And then here's the confession here. I'm kind of I was the department kind of tech geek guy, right? So
Mm,
no stereotypes there, but
fulfilling that, yeah.
yeah, right around that time, Silicon Valley, which is where Mountain View is the middle of, started to just take off. So there were these high tech crime detective assignments. Um, that was like perfect intersection of my interests and my talents at the time. I got to spend a couple years with the FBI High Tech Crimes Task Force out here in Silicon Valley. I mean, this is dream come true type of stuff. And then, another rotation back as a person crimes detective before the promotional opportunities came. And I want your listeners to understand these, along the way, there were a lot of denials, like, hey, thanks for putting in, but
Mm,
so I don't want to portray it as if I had easy way to go. But each step along the way, I learned and grew and got feedback on things I can improve on. Parallel to all this time was I got to pursue another dream assignment, which was SWAT. And in our department, it was a collateral assignment. It's a medium-sized agency, so we would pair up with another city next door. I mean, I ended up getting to move. I was so fortunate that every time I got a promotion, I got to stay on the team
mm.
because the guy above me was also moving. He eventually
Oh,
became the
yeah.
chief. So,
Hmm.
I went from operator on the assault team to sniper to tactical commander, right, as a lieutenant. So I got to do 13 years doing that. Um, Along the way, on the other parallel track, just promotions, bouncing in and out of patrol, in and out of detectives, um, learning a ton about myself, about leadership, about good examples of leaders, bad examples of leaders. Fortunately for me, I had quite a few great mentors along the way that spent the time to just be vulnerable and be kind of open and honest about their shortcomings, their insecurities, how they lead, and it really baked me in a sense toward a track of where I am today.
Yeah, I love that. And for the listeners, it's something that I want to highlight, especially because I just had a conversation with one of my officers where it was about trying to forecast certain openings and career opportunities, which I love. I love that he was so diligent to do that. I think oftentimes we don't take the time to do that. And if you have an agency that's institutionalizing that and making it essentially regular and systematic, I love that, right? For development and just and pushing the pace on that, so it just doesn't happen, by accident or by happenstance. But in that, what I heard you recognize was that you had interest, tech and interest and aptitude, and then there were opportunities for that. At the same time, you love the exciting stuff, and so you were able to do SWAT duties as well. So it's all my way of saying, and this is where the conversation went, was, hey, I love that you're forecasting a few years out. Keep that in part of your mind, but at the same time, like, this department could look extremely different in 3 to 4 years. As we look back 3 to 4 years when you started, when I can tell you 3 to 4 years prior to that, the units are very different. They get rebranded, they get reoriented. There's new needs. There's what this unit is doing is 180 degrees different than what I was doing 7 or 8 years ago. And just trying to have officers recognize this more open-mindedness and approach to perhaps seek opportunities in skill development and personal passion development rather than specific role.
Yeah, there's this interesting, those are all really spot on observations. Like, there's this interesting phenomenon that happens when you test for a promotion or you test for a specialty is you prepare so much that in the end you are 110% convinced that you're the guy or you're the gal. Like, there's no question. And so when that denial comes and say, hey, thanks for putting in, I see a lot of people right there. I mean, obviously it's emotionally devastating, right?
Yeah.
But that's where I see, in my experience, having been the one who has had to deliver that news sometimes to people, is you see some people go on a different track where they grow, they take a step back, they take some time to mourn and be disappointed, and then they kick it in gear and they really just, become even a better version of themselves. And then there's another track where people just kind of, they pick the wrong people to vent to. They disparage the system. They just nosedive. It's everyone's fault but theirs. No personal responsibility or growth.
Right.
And I've seen that reaction. I've had people just flat out lose it in the chief's office, right? And I'm like, the first thing that goes through my head is, I made the right decision. Like,
yeah, you proved it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Which is so sad, right? When you think about the individual and the trajectory, but that's kind of, I love how you put it, but that's kind of where my mind was going, to offer that there are people that put their name in the hat. And granted, sometimes you learn a bit enough about a job and it doesn't pan out, and you're like, oh man, that wasn't the right fit. And like, kudos to those people for the introspection and going through the process and putting themselves out there, because it's not comfortable to do that, especially do that and then get denied. But for some that do put in and they're like, well, they didn't want me because XYZ and the game and politics, I'm like, well, you've proven it, right? Whereas I can think of numerous people that you described where they certainly had a hard time, right? But they regroup, they seek feedback immediately, they receive, and they actually put all that into action. And I've seen a lot of people promote and then deliver, and they are fantastic. They were, looking back, you're like, yes, absolutely, you earned your promotion, and we're glad we promoted you as an agency. And back then, we're glad we didn't, because you weren't ready and you had to do that work. You had to go into the gauntlet and do all these things to get to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every bump in the road is experience, right? And if we went through our careers and everything was perfect and easy, you wouldn't make a very good leader. I mean, it's the leaders who have been through the mud, right? The suck, themselves are the ones we want to follow and are inspired by.
Yeah. Yeah. And even when, cutting back to the beginning of the interview, when I was sharing, when I got hired and I started getting job offers, or prior to me getting hired, when I got to pick, which was very unique at the time back then, pre 2008 recession. So it was when everyone was hiring like crazy because the boomers were starting to leave and we had troops overseas. So I had that opportunity that is now existing again. But I didn't just it wasn't just like I walked in the door like, oh, Asian dude, come on in. Like, I failed oral board. I placed 17th, which means basically you failed in some of these agencies because they never get to you. And then I got 9th, and then I got first, and then I got first. And I was like, okay, like, I figured it out, right? But it was that essence. So I know that there are people really early in their career listening, and some of those are so early because they're pre-career. And so I tell people, like, be patient. And I know that a lot of these really young, hungry folks, like, I know because I was that, it seems like an eternity when you don't hear back from a background investigator for 2 weeks. Okay, like give it 3 weeks, and especially if they open the door to follow up, then absolutely follow up. But be very aware that you're dealing with the government. Things take time, and then in the course of all of this, your 6-month process, 1-year process, it'll be a drop in the bucket for your whole career.
Yeah, it always helps to have, we call it like the 40,000 foot level, right? When you're looking down and you can almost see the curve of the earth type of thing, and as it relates to your career, right? But it's hard. A lot of times we're just in the weeds and always see is what's immediately around us. I went to this executive leadership program once, and a guy by the name of Marty Linsky has a book called Leadership on the Line. Excellent book. He talks about when you're on the dance floor, and imagine like you're dancing, you're grooving, whatever. There's a live band in front of you. That's one thing. That's being in the weeds. But he encourages leaders to step up to the balcony, like physically, mentally, emotionally, take yourself up to the balcony and look down on that dance floor. And a lot of times what you'll notice are maybe the people standing off to the side. Maybe someone's wearing something right now. Figuratively, in your career, it's the same thing. It never hurts. It's actually probably a good thing to go to the balcony and just look down and kind of take it all in and be quiet with yourself just for a second and just kind of figure out where do I need to kind of move and navigate to in this direction, that direction. You'll find that the more broader sense of perspectives or learning that you can do, and it can be all sorts of things, podcasts, books, whatever, that's absolutely going to benefit you and your career. For your listeners that are early in your career, it's so fun to learn all the cool stuff, the driving, the shooting, everything. Yeah, take it all in. But on top of that, don't forget to grow in other ways and not just isolate yourself to the cool police stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I'm thinking about it in a couple contexts. One is that, cut back to this conversation with this young officer I have. And what I started asking him about was ensuring that he had other things going on outside of work, right? It was ensuring that he had hobbies, and he was telling me about all these other things he's doing. I'm like, oh, okay, fantastic. Because I wanted to make sure that the hard chargingness and that really driven nature wasn't everything. I wanted to make sure that there were other pieces that were going to prevent an over identity of being a cop, because that is my firm belief, is that if we make sure we have other things, it actually helps us be a cop better, right? If we go 100% cop, like, we actually fail at being a cop, which is kind of a weird thing. Being a family man makes you a better cop, makes you more patient, right? But if you are super cop, then you're putting your family on the back burner. It actually doesn't round you out the right way for you to show up to that family in crisis, for a very simple kind of pedestrian example.
Yeah, and if all of your friends are cops, that's a bad sign, right? You got, or the things you do socially. And I'll tell you, for those of your listeners on the back half of your career, that transition from wearing that uniform to hanging it up and retiring, it was a really smooth landing for me because, one, throughout my career, I loved being a cop, but I didn't identify who I was as Chris. Was not my title. It was not my badge. So, I miss it. I miss the friends. I miss the uniform, but I'm not devastated by it. And I've met so many, or I remember so many colleagues, right? You can just tell they're a year or two after retirement. They're just not the same. It's like a part of their heart was ripped out, and that's because their whole identity was built on a career. And it's a tough career, but there's more to this life than the career. And to your point, when you're whole as a person, as a human being, you're going to be a better cop. So encourage everyone, find those hobbies, find those passionate interests and pursue those, and especially your family.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And that's exactly where I was thinking about going with what you just shared about taking that, that bird's eye view, right? Going up top, looking down, because I'm definitely not coming from a place where I have it figured out. The reason why I constantly talk about leadership and things like that is because I'm trying to learn it, and essentially talking about it is helping me, right? So hopefully listeners get that, is like I'm in the mix, and I'm continually making those mistakes because I am doing this job. But essentially, I love that allegory, because looking back and then trying to apply that when I can, it's helping me remove this pent up emotion over something not going well at work, right? Or trying to move a program or an idea, but getting stalled in that and not knowing what to do. Or when the guys feel so dejected about this thing and I don't know what to do for them, it helps me recognize like a little bit farther out. It's not just in this moment, but zoom out a little bit and look at, okay, are our guys doing the right thing? Are we doing the right thing? Yes, and this is an uncomfortable time, but this too shall pass. It's just part of the thing. And then it essentially goes back to that overinvestment over identity, right? Where this is, if it's too much of our whole existence, then it does feel like the sky's falling because that's all we're thinking about. But at the end of the day, it's this many hours that we spend here. And to make any positive change, it takes a long time and a lot of work. And we can't do it all overnight.
Absolutely.
It helps me in, going back to this conversation with the officer, and I told him, I didn't know whether this would help him, but I just invited him to think about it. But it's exactly what you talked about, being on the back half and just sharing that sense of, I suppose, stoicism, and inviting him to think about what happens after you're a cop and you think back to these moments. Will you will you tell yourself that you should have spent more time planning and worrying about all these contingencies, or would you say, man, I should have just trusted the process and just had fun, right? Because this is still a really fun job, and I love when people say that. I know that someone might be like, you're a commander, what are you talking about? But no, but for the average officer, just to be out there and have that ability to affect people in this positive way, and drive fast sometimes, and shoot guns at work and get paid X amount to do that. I mean, that's pretty fantastic. So I think sometimes it can be really grounding just to take that zoom out and then imagine when one day you hang it up, because one day you'll have to. Hopefully it's exactly when you want to.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those professions where we get to intersect with people at the lowest point in their lives, and we get to change the arc of someone's whole history. I mean, there's very few professions that you can do that, and it's a very misunderstood profession. But again, it's just these opportunities that everyone in this career leaves with this like amazing diary of experiences, right? And do some soul searching and figure out, what that might translate into post retirement. I mean, I know this show isn't specifically for like a post retirement thing, but I can tell you how quickly, and I've heard this from many retired chiefs and friends, like how fast the agency just moves on once you leave.
Mm-hmm.
We'd all like to think like, oh, big loss and they can't operate without me. But it happens when you leave a unit. It happens when you leave a patrol team. It happens when you promote out. The machine keeps going. And that's just
Yeah.
how it's built, designed that way. And so if you lock your identity into that machine or that boat, let's use that example, it's just going to keep sailing away, and you're going to go on your port of call and you're going to be waving bye-bye. So I say, why not, figuratively have that drink in your hand with the umbrella and with a smile on your face, as opposed to sadness or sorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because we talked about that off recording, and it was that recognition that even at an executive level, you can be building all these things and culture can be really healthy and vibrant. And you did share that you had colleagues that are like, they basically got the news back from some of the people they used to work with. Man, things are backsliding. We're going back to how things used to be before we as the team were building up in this direction. And I think that's really healthy to share from a leadership perspective or a leadership role, because that's often the narrative that is as said in such a dejected way, right? We're just a body, we're just a number. After we're gone, and it's poof, we keep moving on, right? Someone takes the overtime spot or someone gets hired, it's a boot in my spot, and the machine goes on. And I like mentioning that because it's true, and it's not to make us feel sad and mad about it, but it just is, right? It's just, I've said this before in certain ways where the department doesn't care because the department isn't a living creature. It doesn't have feelings. It's the people within, right? So how do you feel about that? Have you thought about this and reflected on this? Is it too much of your identity? Because one day, whether you are a beat cop that never wanted to do any other role, never wanted responsibility, like good on you. It's the same as the chief when you leave. The thing goes on. Someone's going to sit in your chair and keep doing your role.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it is a pretty frequent recent discussion, because ultimately all of these conversations, my goal is to help cops be better in all ways. And I do think that is a piece of it. It's a really uncomfortable piece for a lot of us to think about, what if not this job? But we honestly should think about it. I think especially those who have done this job since 2019, 2020, should be thinking about it more proactively. But at the same time, I literally brought it up with one of my officers recently, and he kind of sat back in his chair. He's like, "Oh man, don't ask me that." And I'm like, "That's exactly the point. That's why we're talking about it." And I gave him some examples of constructive thoughts and kind of exercises to kind of get us there. Um, all right, so I want to pivot to your movement up the chain and executive leadership. What were some of the motivators in that? I know that you shared briefly about good and bad leaders, and maybe we'll talk about some of those concepts and how it shaped your leadership philosophy and style. But yeah, where did that innate desire, I suppose, grow from?
Well, I was one of those guys that I just wanted to be patrol for life. I just loved it, right? And I was gonna be an officer, and I was gonna be a detective, and go to all the cool task force stuff. And then I had mentioned earlier in your show how I was at the beginning of this hiring wave, right? So there's opportunities coming up, the department's growing, and you start seeing guys that you're just like you don't really respect. You're just like,
Mm,
holy cow, they're putting in for that. And then one of
yep.
my mentors, he was a sergeant. He goes, well, he's like, you're gonna test? I'm like, no, I'm not gonna test. I'm gonna keep doing my thing. And he's like, well, that's kind of selfish of you, isn't it? And I mean, holy, this is why this guy's a mentor, right? And then he goes, well, think of it this way. Could you go work for that person? I was like, man, I can't. And he
Mm,
goes, well, I think you know your answer then. And so that began this journey of testing and not always getting it, but then learning at each step of the way. And I had some sergeants that pop into my head right now where they rolled up on scene, they portrayed themselves to be perfect, they were arrogant, they were not fun to work for.
hmm
And then I had sergeants like this other guy who he was my detective sergeant, a brand new rookie property crimes detective. I come in and he was a traffic guy, but he had I think he did a couple stints in investigations, but he just got moved over. We didn't really know each other, but he goes, "Hey, Chris, I know you're new to this, but here's my commitment to you is that uh, as you learn and grow into this role, if you don't know something, come ask me, and if I don't know the answer, which might happen, we'll learn it together." And that was really instrumental, having just come off a team of the perfect sergeant, right? And so along the way, I started to and I'll have my confession here to you is I probably wasn't comfortable in my own skin as a leader until my second year as a captain.
mm,
And I think about that, right? Like, I think roughly, if I remember correctly, it was like a year and a half, 2 years as an agent. They're like corporals, and then about 3-ish years as a sergeant. Um, all along, right around the 2-year mark is when you start to get comfortable at something, and then I would move up. And there was a couple years, I think like 6 or 7 years as a lieutenant. All during that time, I'm learning about myself, I'm learning about my style, but what I'm really doing is copying other people's styles and trying them on. And I can remember being really intimidated. Just, as a sergeant, I had a corporal or an agent that worked for me who had like decades of experience on me. And he wasn't happy with the fact that he had some young rookie sergeant in charge of him.
hmm
And I had to have some difficult conversations with him. And I flat out chickened out. Like I just couldn't do it. I didn't have the skills. I didn't have the experience. And not that he bullied me, but he was in charge,
He was
right?
testing you. Yeah,
Yeah,
he was
totally.
pushing. Hmm
Um, and then you fast forward, second year as a captain, I finally was like, I have the formal rank, but now I kind of figured out who I am. Like, I'm not your typical um, rank heavy, traditional power. You got to follow me and you got to follow my orders, which were examples that I had seen, and I had gravitated towards some other examples in the agency. Finally, I don't know if it was an overnight thing. I was like, I'm kind of done trying to just pretend. I'm done chasing. I'm just gonna say what comes to mind. I'm gonna be comfortable
Yeah.
in my own skin. I had some great colleagues and confidants within the department, and that just gave me a lot more confidence to just speak out. And I think along this time also, there's social media is going on. I'm starting to get comfortable with this digital professional branding thing. It's You're really good at it now, but I tell you, 10, 15 years ago, it was like unheard of to
Mm.
get out there, especially as a cop, to get out there and start to talk
It's
about,
still
you know,
uncomfortable. Yeah, there's a lot of people that think that I'm a big idiot for doing any of it, or even being as candid as I am. But
uh,
not to make it about me, but ultimately. I believe that if something I say and I think it's pretty balanced and it's
Mhm.
honest, if that's too much and it closes certain doors, then that's okay. Then they're
Yeah,
not the doors I
yeah,
need to go towards anyway.
yeah. And what I've noticed, especially with the online world, is not enough police leaders are out there, which is why the community, which is largely on social media, has this huge misunderstanding of what we do or how we lead, right? That void is filled by Hollywood narratives
Hmm.
or the voices that are anti-police. And so it's for when I teach at classes and stuff, I tell these leaders, I go, we need you to get out there. We need your voice. We need your values. We need the young coppers to see the example of what it means to be a leader out there in this digital world. And they're slowly coming along. But it's important. So I'm grateful for the work that you do.
No, thank you. And there's a lot I want to go back to, but we'll stay on what you just talked about. And I appreciate you sharing that, right? When you're like, I wasn't comfortable with myself, my leadership brand, if you will, until you were a captain,
Mhm.
some stint into it. And I think that's really, really healthy to share with others because, yeah, you're a brand new cop. You're trying to figure it out, right? So you mimic this cop, that cop. You try to find your style. And I found that was very much the same for each role or rank I took. And so, sergeant, I was certainly very comfortable by the time I had a few years in as a sergeant, right? I knew my thing. I knew how I ran my crews. I knew how I wanted to do patrol stuff. But then when I went into a specialty, I had to learn a new thing. And I feel like that's where I maybe professionally and also just life wise gained a level of maturity in my early 30s where I was like, okay, like this is who I am. This is the guy I am. And I'm
Mhm.
going to be less concerned about the naysayers. That's always there, right? But that peanut gallery is always kind of sounding off for me, especially as I try to continue doing the things I'm doing. And it bothers me that it bothers me at times, right? But usually it feels like less time that something will affect me, and then I keep moving on, right? Because they're not my audience anyway. But I really like how you shared that because even I can recount as a new sergeant, and I was younger than many, but I had that guy that basically I called him out for not making it in briefing, and he's kind of I call him. I'm like, hey man, this is the second time you didn't make it back for briefing for roll call. There's something up, or you caught on something, and he basically kind of scoffs like on the phone. I can hear it, like it's inaudible. Okay, and I'm like, and my personality is also not to go on a power trip, but I was like, all right, we're gonna address this, just not right now. I'm not gonna do it on the phone, but I ended up just showing up to his next call, like, because I know where he's at. That's the crazy thing. But I just met up with him. I kind of backed him on the call. And then once the call was wrapped, I was like, hey, man, you got a minute? And he's like, yeah. It's like, hey, I didn't like how that conversation went, man. Like, I addressed something that you need to do. It's not just about you. Everyone has that expectation. I tried to give you the benefit of the doubt and asking you guys something going on. And I feel like you hung up on me and I feel like you scoffed at me. I don't appreciate it, man. I don't want to have it again. Immediately after that, like it was like a 180. I think he was just testing and he wanted to see because that was his potentially like his power language or whatever, right? Coming from the military. Like that was the language he spoke and he wanted to see what he could get away with. And once I was like, I'll do it on my own terms, but no, like not again. He just did this like about face, right? To keep it in, I suppose, like formal military jargon and like a uniform jargon, but I never had a problem with him again. And I like to share that story and versions of like incidents like that, especially with younger supervisors, because it doesn't always happen. And that means you have a great culture. But I try to tell people, hey, if it does happen, don't be surprised and just be ready for it. And you might not know exactly how you want to react, but that's just food for thought. There's going to be people thinking about it, whether or not they actually do it to your face or whether they do it subversively, which is sad, but it's true.
I'm smiling because you reminded me of kind of a similar story where I was a sergeant in another unit who is my SWAT team assistant team leader. So there's kind of a power imbalance already. He had a stronger personality. I'm more the quiet guy, right? So to your listeners, it's like those of you who are quiet, here's where you say, don't mistake my quietness for, being timid or anything. And I
Hmm.
remember him coming in once in the bureau. So there was some alarm. People were kind of running out of the station, but for some reason I was like, no, we're not going. But he comes in and starts ordering my people around. And if you hear my detectives talk about this story, it's like the first time we've ever seen Chris close the door and hear him shouting at this other sergeant and everyone, it's that visual where everyone's leaning out of their cubicle, like
Yeah.
what's going on.
Yeah.
And I didn't think too much of it. I was just really passionate about, no, you don't get to come in here and order my people around. You get to show me some respect and talk to me first, right? And that's very, I'm typically like, I think the best out of everybody. But that one point in time, I did that, and then for years afterwards, those detectives, as they moved up through the chain, they always talked about that moment. Like, we saw a side of you. It wasn't a bad side, but it was just like, wow, that's the complete leader, right? Like, that you weren't just going to get bowled over by a strong personality, and that you stood up for us. And so it's, again, one of those things where it's a speed bump. You learn. It's not pleasant going through it, but you look back and you're like, yeah, I guess I did some growth in that moment.
Yeah. It's a call to being yourself, not trying to force something, but at the same time, if you don't get all riled up and yelling about everything, it does stand
Mhm.
out so much more significantly, right? It's almost like the parent that leans in and just whispers to their kid rather than yelling. You're like, oh, I'm in it, like
Yeah,
now it's
totally.
really bad. Yeah, I love that. And I love going back to, kind of the ascension of promotion, because how I describe it is when your own interest and passion and I suppose ambition aligns with the agency need, right? Where that intersects that's the perfect time. And I think that the secret sauce, or maybe the special sauce, is when you have people nudging you from all directions, right? When your bosses are like, "Hey, have you thought about promoting? I'd really like to see you put your name in." And then your peers are like, "Hey, I work for you." And you're like, "Oh, heck yeah, right?" And then the people below, right? Like, "Hey, boss, I need you to go farther," right? We could I feel like we could get the type of movement we need if you were willing to put your name in the hat. And I think that when you have that kind of trifecta, that means you're doing things right. It means that you're serving all your people the right way. Because of course, technically your boss is above you, but at the same time, I love when leaders recognize the servant leadership of your people are below you, right? The people that are in charge of you, right? To the people that you are trying to work for are your subordinates, and that could be twisted, right? And sometimes I think one of the easiest archetypes to think about is that sergeant that it's all about protecting their people and f this, f that, but I'm going to take care of my people and f the rest. Well, that's not the whole package, right? Like, we're not actually helping our people by doing that. You're siloing off and you're disjoining the team. So I just kind of wanted to share that, and I love when you kind of shared, essentially, to paraphrase, like, if not me, then who? And that's a classic adage of, if I don't put in, we might all be working for that guy or that gal, and can't sleep on that, So
Can't complain. If you didn't put in, you better not complain.
yeah, yeah. There's a guy in the past that I was nudging because he had certainly the professional credibility, super squared away, and in a pretty early conversation of me just trying to provide that motivation and that support, validation, nothing else, and it was very much like, I totally get it. If you don't want to test, you got to do it for you. But we could really benefit from it, and I believe in you, and you're great. But a lot of the conversation became about how he was not very happy with things, and he could only see that getting worse if he had to be the bearer of bad news, and he had to tell people they're going to mandate, and he just didn't think that he would be in a position to have a better, work relationship, having to be the bearer of bad news. And I was like, okay, if you're looking at it through this narrow of a lens, then you're probably right. Like,
Yeah.
if you're not feeling like you're the right guy, then you're definitely not the right guy. And so those conversations can be very helpful from any direction.
Yep. Absolutely. And I encourage your listeners to, look up, Google search some terms, fixed versus growth mindset.
Hmm.
Um, it really applies. They teach it to grade school kids now, but it applies in our work environments where fixed mindseted people, when trouble or turmoil comes, it's like, woe is me. People with an adaptive growth mindset, it's like, man, okay, well, that sucks, but I'm going to make some lemonade and, maybe some lemon drop martinis, whatever you want, right? Out of this bad situation. And, the latter group tends to excel. And if there's one thing we know about policing, it's always changing. I mean, can't get comfortable because something's always around the corner. And so, instead of being one of those people that just complains about everything, be proactive with your career. You're not trapped. There's always something you can either grow or learn for, and play the long game, because what's right around the corner you might not be able to see. But if you're out there stretching yourself, learning, growing, when those opportunities come up, you'll be really well positioned for it.
Yeah, I love that. And growth mindset. At the time, this airs, it'll probably be out and published. But recent Ask Tongue segment on Police One, I specifically talk about that. The question was, should I promote? And really, what I was trying to attack was, if you say yes or no, make sure you're putting it through the right mindset filter. Because and we talked about a little bit this before, right? Where you're like, well, it's all a political game. I don't play the game, or it's not going to be good for my family life, or this and that and the other. Okay, it may be true, but put it through that mindset. Are you recognizing these limiting narratives or these limiting beliefs from a fair, objective place? At the same time, I love that you talk about growth or abundance mindset, because that is a huge fixture in a course I'm working on, Get Gritty. So look out for that, folks, or in coming days on the social media. But yeah, that's absolutely, I think, one of the things that makes me appreciate this thought sharing and these types of conversations and listening to podcasts, whether it's in police or especially outside of the industry, because I think that that's what really provokes this why not type of mentality. In any traditional work, you tend to follow the convention, and police is not, any exception to that, right? So we tend to do things the way we've been doing them. After a while, there might be perfectly good reasons, but we should be able to cite them. We should be able to know why. And then if why not, then let's start asking questions. Let's start finding that creative innovation and start moving those directions. And if people are saying no, then let's ask why not and try to get there.
Right. Yeah, and there's this interesting dynamic. The success of someone's career arc can often be placed with their ability to envision the perspective of the role they're trying to get to, that next step. Right. So if you're an officer, the more you can think like a sergeant, the better you will probably test for sergeant, and that goes all the way up. And then there's this interesting dynamic that happens where, let's say you're a sergeant, most of the tools on your belt to solve your issues are going to be what you have as an officer, and that's great. You have that time and expertise. What happens at the next step as a lieutenant is now you're working with other city or county departments, and then you go up another step. As a captain, you're working with nonprofit groups, you're working with political figures, important people in the community. You have to have that finely tuned radar for politics, and then you go up even higher and higher. So my point is, when we talked about stretching yourself earlier, is you never want to go into a promotion testing like you're the expert on where you currently are.
Yep.
Right? The ability to kind of explain to an oral board panel that you think differently, that you think broader, whatever that next step is. That's only going to come if you stretch yourself in those areas. And, a lot of times that means putting yourself on different schools yourself that maybe your department can't send you to, or reading that book that, doesn't totally excite you, but it's a blind spot of yours. Listen to that podcast, whatever it might be. But that was always my kind of theory was, as I tested for these things, I wanted the oral board panel at the end of the day to do the debrief and tell the chief, that guy's your next sergeant. That guy's your next lieutenant or your next chief. All right. And that was my goal behind the scenes as I tested. And it worked sometimes. Didn't work every time, but it worked enough.
Yeah. I love that. That is a very common critique that, having sat on a lot of sergeant boards for other agencies, I'll say it, or the person next to me will say it. And when we debrief, we're like, they're answering like an officer. And that's so frequent. Like you might have the highest confidence that they're a very squared away officer, but none of their thinking or planning or answers conveyed the role of the sergeant. And so that's fantastic advice for people to think about, not just on test day, but in development kind of brain. I want to recognize your leadership positions at the top. At the same time, I want to give a tease to you returning on a leadership panel where we're going to get more in the weeds of the good and bad leadership, things that we've either experienced or the mistakes we've made, or how we combat issues in leadership, maybe in our leadership groups, or, difficult bosses, all that kind of stuff in a separate segment. So look out for that leadership panel. But I do, Chris, want to talk about the curve. Can you tell us about what the curve is?
Yeah, it's an exciting thing. So about 4 years ago, Simon Sinek, I think that many of you, your listeners, might be aware of. He's a huge leadership influencer. The guy just knows, and he's worked with the military, Navy SEALs. He's done a lot of research with police departments, but he's really well known as one of like the highest grossing, or not grossing, highest number of views on TED Talk for
Mm-hmm.
leadership. Right?
Yeah,
He's
like
got three
old school
books.
TED Talk, like on the
Yeah,
first big ones. Yeah.
exactly. 3 books. Starts with Why, Leaders Eat Last, Infinite Game. Definitely reading list material for promotions. Well, he in the summer of 2020, when the world kind of seems on fire for policing and all the civil unrest, he's like, we need to fix this. And so he knew Chief Jack Cawley in Castle Rock, Colorado, because actually Jack's profiled in the Infinite Game. And so he
Mm-hmm.
tells Jack, he goes, "Hey, can you go and find some of your more forward-thinking police leaders out there, and let's get in a Zoom and talk." Um, to me, that was like a wow fanboy moment, because my prior chief had put Starts with Why on the sergeant's reading list
Mm-hmm.
12 years prior, right? Or whatever,
Yeah.
15 years prior. So I'm like, holy cow, of course I'd love this opportunity. So those discussions turn into routine, kind of repeating vent sessions, which then turn into, we have something here where the issue is the culture of policing. The culture of leadership within policing is outdated. It just hasn't really moved along much, whereas other sectors have kind of grown and evolved, including the military. Right? The military has their commandant's reading list. They send their best and brightest off to schools outside of the military, and they come
Mm-hmm.
back and they evolve. Well, policing, what have we done? We lean heavily towards how Hollywood has portrayed us, and we kind of enculturate that as who we are. The prototypical, stereotypical American police show drives more about culture than we do ourselves, right? So
We
the
kind of like it
call,
too, right? We
we
wallow
do
in a weird way. Like,
totally.
there's so many cops and supervisors that just,
Mhm.
they even lead with, I'm just a dumb cop. I'm just a dumb cop, so what do I know? I've said it before,
Exactly.
right? To try to like
Yeah,
break the
yeah,
ice. And
yeah. And most of us
anyway,
can tie our recruitment incentive to a TV show, right?
yeah.
TJ Hooker and Chips for me. So I'm an
Mm-hmm.
old generation guy.
Yeah.
New
Cops,
generation,
the
Live
show.
PD, right?
Yeah.
So that, the Curve, we formed a nonprofit, and the real emphasis is, let's on top of all this, the perishable skills training, everything like that, what's the biggest thing that's missing in policing? And that's teaching leaders how to basically supervise and lead and inspire other humans. And I've seen this play out many times across the country, is leaders who are inspirational, who see their people for humans who they are, with all the faults and warts and everything, and lead them. And they lead with courageous vulnerability, meaning they portray themselves as like they're learning too. They're on this journey with everyone else. You toss the ego aside, you toss the arrogance aside that sometimes comes with rank, and power, right? And it's a funny thing that happens, that when we lead people like that, they turn around and they lead the community and
Mm-hmm.
interact with the community in similar ways. But I mean, typically, if you look at your typical policing culture, it's when you get hired and you're the boot. It's like, go sit in that corner, shut up, and we don't want to hear from you, right? And it's like, why do we do that? Why do we stifle creativity, innovation, or this weird dynamic of never admitting that you're wrong? Well, if you look at most debriefs of tactical incidents, it's typically because someone in that chain of decision making actually, or someone in the room, had the right answer, but they probably didn't raise their hand because they were afraid. It was not okay. The culture was like that. So these are all things that the Curve's really focused on equipping and training leaders. And we would describe it more as a social movement as opposed to just another training outfit. And it's like super exciting, because we're in year 4 now, and this year, of all the years, we've really gotten active. If you follow us on LinkedIn, we're doing a website redesign right now, and there's a YouTube channel that, free training videos and webinars for everyone to just talk to, watch. They're like 3 or 4 minutes long. They're conversation starters, and that's the whole purpose.
Yeah. I love it. And this is something that I get super excited when I see and I meet people that look outside of the industry, because that's just the quickest way to think outside the box, right? It's literally like outside of our
Yeah.
own echo chamber. And it's a great start when you talk to people outside of your unit, outside of your squad, and then you can magnify that out. That's why I tell new people, I'm like, hey, make friends in Academy and keep those friends, because not only is it really comforting to know that everyone has the same problems and the same leadership issues or what have you, right? Those are leadership reps, as I've heard. Take strong notes on what you see that you don't like, because you can be better than that, and you can start employing that at your level always. But yeah, we build leadership, and we need to recognize that every cop is a leader in their community, in their family, and like continue to build and invest that from the time they're a new hire or even a candidate, right? Like try to do what you can in your engagements to build ownership and a strong mindset, this growth mindset. Then absolutely we're going to be building people the right way to be taking over any role, right? Not just rank, but like detectives and SWAT and all these different roles. School resource officer, one of the most critical roles, in my opinion, for specialized policing in our nation. So I love that. And I share this with you, but I have this habit when I see an article, either in social media or Police One or something like that, or a video or a podcast, and I don't have the means to look at it right away. But if I'm at work, I'll take that link and I'll send myself an email. It's just like a kind of like a ledger, like, hey, you got to come back to this. But I had seen what you were doing on LinkedIn and social media. And then I had in my own inbox when I started going back, as I do usually monthly roughly, but you know, you put out the fires you can, you address all these things, and then you get down deep into the inbox, like earlier that month, the things that you knew you didn't flag and they weren't exigent. And then I had like an article that you wrote, and I saw something in reference to the curve. And then when we connected and you sent me that article, I was like, oh, I already told myself, like my prior me told myself to read this article. So I love it. And I'm excited to see what the curve keeps doing, because it is really this hub. I think that it's not just me, but there's a lot of people that I've been able to connect with, especially through the social and the online space, that essentially have been yearning for this type of hub of positive, forward thinking material, right? Just to help us all be better leaders and just really take ownership and just build team and build mission. So yeah, I love it.
And I don't want your listeners to confuse, like it's not soft, it's not like foo-foo stuff. We would absolutely say you have to be totally trained as a cop and all the perishable skill stuff, but this is like an add-on. It's what's been missing.
Mm-hmm.
You think about whenever anyone gets promoted in our industry, they might go to the state certified, you got to go check this box, but you don't learn how to be a leader. You don't learn how to have difficult conversations with someone, or how to sit someone down and truly learn how to listen. Like listening is a skill, and it's a perishable skill, and our default setting as humans is we suck at it, right? And just
Mm-hmm.
look at your own personal relationships, where if you have a spouse, 9 times out of 10 maybe they're saying something really heated and you're already forming your comeback.
Mm-hmm.
That's not listening. And that's very true in our professional lives, right? Like I can't tell you how many times in the community, all they want, and we know this from the tenured sergeants, the really good officers that are out there, they know how to just sit there and hold space with someone and just let them vent. And when that person feels like they're heard, and there's that, body language and voice and tone that goes with it,
Yep.
that's just the bridge that gets you to that next level of now we can talk and understand each other. But what's the default setting coming out of the academy or in many, many agencies is like, it's a power dynamic. It's like, I wear the uniform. You need to shut your mouth because I'm going to tell you what you should be believing right now, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we do it even internally with our folks when we want people to develop, but we sit them down and there's a power dynamic already because there's rank, and you're not listening intently to what's going on. Because what do we know is that most people in our hallways, and I would tell people in Mountain View PD this all the time, just assume that everyone that we're working with is going through something really bad. It's either kids, marriage, family, you name it. There are stressors, but we are phenomenal at putting on that vest, and we're phenomenal at putting on that figurative kind of like shield, like everything's great. I'm just
Yep.
going to walk these hallways. And it's the inspiring leader that stops and just kind of goes with the default setting, like everyone I'm leading here is going through something. So I need to have that kind of human side where maybe it's a performance issue, and instead of coming in with a conversation like, hey, I noticed your numbers are down, what's wrong, why aren't you doing this and that, it's more like, hey, I noticed your numbers are going down, is everything okay, can we talk? and
Mm-hmm.
and just to hold space and listen, not preach, not give advice, and just kind of let that out.
Yep. And that's huge. And yeah, we're terrible listeners, myself included. During this interview, how many times I probably interrupted you, right?
Yeah.
Because we get excited, and sometimes it's not from a I know better, but it absolutely is, like you explained, where that traditional or conventional or old school, whatever we say, yes, we show up to a call and we are fixing the problem, and like, no, you sit down. No, you sit down right now. And we know where that can go if someone disagrees. And how we're evolving to a space where we need to be recognizing not only is it good, but we need to praise it, and we need to recognize our officers when they're doing it. There was a commendation that I loved because I heard the officer even telling the story, and he was kind of annoyed by it, but at the same time, like he knew it was the right thing to do. But it was a dementia patient that needed to go, involuntarily committed to the hospital, and it's involuntary, so we could force it, right? But eventually it got to the point where, the officers, there's a group of them, and they're like, hey, is there anything we can do to get you to sit on the gurney, man? Like, you've been cool with us. He's like, laugh. And they're like, laugh? And I know for a fact how a certain crew that I used to work on, myself included, would be like, I ain't laughing. Like, be funny and I'll laugh, right? Like, you can't make me laugh, right? I'm not going to just do it. Like, I'm not going to dance, right? Just because you said so. But the officers all look at each other like, ha ha ha, and they're like kind of like getting each other just to like just force this laugh, and they'd stop, and the guy would stop, and they're like, oh god, okay, here we go. And then they all just laugh. They laughed the guy into the gurney like the Pied Piper, and ultimately like no hands were put on him. Everything was copacetic, everything was positive, right? Like that was the goal, right? The goal wasn't to do something without reducing your ego. The goal is to get this guy some help. And then fantastic, like extra credit, you didn't even have to touch him, you didn't even have to yell at him. Nothing. You just laughed. So I loved it when the sergeant recognized that, put it in writing, something positive we can put in everyone's file. But yeah, I was like ecstatic to sign that off and like validate that when I heard the story. I'm like, that's fantastic.
And it's up to the leader to set that tone in an organization that praises that, right? So that speaks to the culture where you're from, because that sergeant felt like this would be acceptable and this is something that's promoted, as opposed to other cultures and other organizations might be like, I can't even bring this up because, they'd laugh at us or ridicule whatever.
What else can people expect to see from the Curve? Where can they find that information and start following along?
So we're more active right now on LinkedIn. So just do a search on The Curve. They're free to connect with me as well. I love those online connections. We're rebranding and rebuilding our website right now. It's up. It's thecurve.org. It's let's just say myself and Simon designed it over the course, and Jack Hawley over the course of a weekend when we had to pull up YouTube and how do you build a web space on Squarespace. So a little bit of beginner, so that's why we're revamping that. But YouTube channel, just search on YouTube for The Curve, has a ton of resources. There's webinars on there that we've had. These webinars are exactly what you were talking about earlier, bringing in outside voices that are tried and true leaders from outside. We just had one with Rich Davini, and he was leader of SEAL Team 6. We had one with Will Gadara, who's in the restaurant business and wrote a book called Unreasonable Hospitality, all jam-packed with takeaways for everything that we do in policing.
I love that. Chris, well, thank you so much for the time. And can you please share where people can get a hold of you or reach out to you?
Absolutely. So on LinkedIn, Chris Hsiung, that's spelled Hsiung. And same thing on Instagram. I'm pretty active there. It's chris.hsiung is my Instagram account. For your listeners, if you want to connect, please do. I'm a firm believer in just helping out in that kind of police mantra where if someone clicks the mic and needs help or pushes the button, then you help. I mean, that's just who we are, and that's how we've been raised. And so that's carried on into my retired life. So if I could be of assistance to any of your listeners, please reach out.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for the time and for your leadership example. I've certainly benefited from it so much and continue to do so. And stay tuned for Chris on that leadership panel upcoming in episodes.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.